All right, beautiful people. Welcome to the Stoa. Everyone's favorite ritual artist is returning to the Stoa, Rebecca Fox, in a session titled Describing Ritual. If you recall, back in the summer, Rebecca was our ritualist in residence here, and she had a 4-part series at the Stoa. It's a lovely series that talked about the 4 aspects of ritual. And at the end of each session, Rebecca had bespokely designed a ritual for a participant. And that series was not recorded, though. And so Rebecca and I had a conversation, like, there's so much wisdom bombs you dropped in that series. It would be awesome for you to return and describe your sense and understanding of what ritual is. And so that's what we're doing here today. And how today is going to work, it's a 90-minute session. I'm going to take Rebecca in. She'll present for about 45 minutes, and we'll have an open dialogue exchange. If you have any questions, pop in the chat anytime. And I imagine Rebecca will set the frame for that in a moment. So that being said, Rebecca, tag you're it, and welcome back to the Stoa.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for coming. So for those of you who don't know what I'm about and why I'm here, I'll explain as much as I can why I'm here talking to you today about ritual. I've been on a journey to get here. I started out as a teen witch. It was the 90s, in my defense. And then I moved through a sort of skeptical, materialist, rationalist phase. And now I'm here today as a ritualist. So this is like a journey, I guess, from naive belief to no belief, in fact, complete rejection of belief, to what I like to think of as a nuanced belief. You may or may not disagree with me on that. I don't think, though, that this is just the reason why I'm here. I think this is the reason why you're here, why a lot of you are here today. And I think that because the people I talk to, the ritual clients that I create ritual with, they often have a similar story. Not all of them are witches, but a lot of them went through this journey from like pre-rationalist, rationalist, post-rationalist. And often that bridge, as Evan McMullen calls it, the bridge between rationality and woo, is what they're navigating with me and with the ritual we create together. But I actually don't think it's just me. Actually, if anyone relates to this at all, if you give me a smile or a wink or like a smiley in the chat, that would be fantastic, just so I know I'm not alone. Be reassuring. Yeah, hands up. Fantastic. Phew. So I don't think it's just us. I think we're part of a broader cultural movement that is recognizing the value of stuff outside the scientific material lens, is recognizing that we want more than what that lens offers, and that we are more than what that lens defines us as. And I was talking to Peter about this a little while ago, and he pointed out that you can see it in the content of the Stoa. So at the beginning of the Stoa, way back when, it was all these galaxy brain, big ideas, philosophy people, and they're still here, obviously, and we love them. But the embodiment practices began to creep in, and then the weird stuff, a bit of tarot, a bit of occultism, and eventually you get to like the epitome of weird, me. So I think that is indicative of a shift that we're seeing all across our culture. And I think the reason why we're experiencing this, what I think of as a renaissance of ritual, because it's not just me who's getting excited about this and talking about this, there's a lot of people, is something to do with that broader cultural movement. And since I rekindled my personal ritual practice and started studying, reading the books and talking to people about ritual and creating ritual with and for people, this question is just like echoing in the back of my head the whole time. And it's constant. So it's like when I'm making the bed, when I'm ordering a drink at a bar, when I'm coming onto a Zoom call today, just, is this a ritual? Is this a ritual? Is this what we're doing right here, right now, a ritual? And to answer that question, of course, you need a definition of what ritual is, which is trickier than you might think, because the definitions you'll find in dictionaries are really not useful or sufficient. So I started asking people. I started asking all of my ritual clients. Anyone who comes to me for a ritual knows that that's the first question I ask you. I ask people at the Ritual Studio workshop. I asked my friends and family. I didn't go quite as far as asking the postman, but I was close. And I started to notice these patterns and these themes emerging in people's definitions. So that I'm going to ask you guys that question right now. What is your definition of ritual? And if you put it in the chat, I would love to hear it. I'll export the chat later for research purposes. But just to give you like a feel, sort of flavor of the sort of responses I've been working with, and it'll be really cool to see if you mirror, if any of the words that I'm going to give you now are mirrored in your definitions. So these are some of the words that have come up: sacred, attention, art, tradition, myth, container, metaphor, meaning, language, form, transformation, love. I really can't wait to read your definitions, so please pop them in there, and you can always amend them throughout the course of this, whatever I'm doing, this talk that I'm giving. See if anything shifts inside you, or your perspective on ritual shifts. So after I've asked everyone within asking distance, I turn to the academics. I turn to the field of ritual studies, because there's a whole academic field studying ritual. I turn to these ritual boffins, and I look at what they have to say, and they've been on their own journey. They start off with colonial gentlemen just walking around other people's countries, pointing at things that the people are doing that they perceive as having no rational purpose, saying that's a ritual, that's a ritual, that's a ritual. And that's where the sort of first definition that comes from that academic field comes from. It comes from looking at other cultures, traditional cultures, and seeing these apparently non-rational acts. And then you have a bunch of scholars who romanticize ritual, and I really like these guys. I'm probably familiar with someone who is in this group, as far as I see it, is someone like Joseph Campbell, and they believe that there is something intrinsically sacred or numinous about ritual, and that ritual is a way to make contact with something beyond the mundane world. Then you have the sort of politically revolutionary academics who talk about the power of ritual, but not in a good way. They're talking about this sort of dangerous power of ritual and the way that it can enforce compliance to outdated modes of power structures, basically. They're very suspicious of ritual, so suspicious of ritual, sometimes you're reading their work and you're like, why are you even in this field? You clearly hate it, but fair enough, it's interesting stuff. And then about 40 years ago, the whole field takes this, what they call the reflexive turn, which is happening all across academia, and especially across sociology, anthropology, all those subjects, where they realize that the frames that they're using, that they're looking through, the contextual, conceptual frames that they are seeing ritual through, are influencing what they think ritual is. And they begin to get kind of insecure. Like, is this even a thing? Have we invented it? We've been talking about it. Is ritual a thing? And this leaves me, as a ritualist, reading all this work, thinking, is this an empty signifier? Is this ritual thing just like a box with nothing in it? Is there nothing there? And I don't think that can be true. I don't want to believe that's true, because it's very bad for business. And also, because there are words for ritual in many different languages, so that would be odd, wouldn't it? If it wasn't a thing and yet everyone's inventing words for it. So that's suggestive. And then the other thing is much more personal, because as I'm doing this work, as I'm deepening my own ritual practice, I'm developing a relationship with this strange thing, this strange force called ritual. So I know it's real because I'm interacting with it. And I'm still looking for that definition, right? Like, what is it? And I realized that perhaps definition isn't the right alley to be looking at. Maybe that's not the right direction to be taking with this field. Maybe I need to switch to a more appreciative interaction with this subject. And that's when I was preparing this talk, I changed the title from defining ritual, which was my original idea, to describing ritual. And that's what I'm going to try and do. I'm going to do my best to do today. What I want to do is, I don't want to find necessary and sufficient conditions. I don't want to carve reality at the joints, as they say. I'm over that. That was the old me. What I want to do today is to sort of honor the concept of ritual, to circumambulate this subject and look at it through 4 different lenses and see where we get with it. And maybe we'll circle back around to something that looks a little bit like a definition by the end. So, as my nerves subside, I'm going to invite you all to close any tabs and to maybe put your phone on Do Not Disturb and just come join me in this appreciation of ritual. I kind of see it as like a devotional to ritual itself. I'm going to present you these 4 metaphors. And to get in the mood, because no ritual would be complete without, I'll just pop and light my candle. Something so soothing about lighting a candle. Feels amazing. And the smell as well. There's a lot of engaging senses in ritual, as I'm sure we'll get to at some point. So here's my first definition. See how this sounds to you. Ritual, it's not a definition. See that old Rebecca keeps coming back. It's not a definition. Here's my first description. Here's my first metaphor for ritual. Ritual is art, which of course raises the question, what is art? And for that, I'm going to turn to Jan Vogler, who's this amazing German cellist. He said, art is what defines us, what makes us human. And he's not the only one who would come up with a similar definition for art. If you think about anthropologists and the field of anthropology, they will often talk about what they call the creative explosion, when humanity suddenly, or it seems sudden, at least in the records that we have, started expressing ourselves creatively about, well, the earliest artifacts that we have, like 45,000 years old, and this would be cave paintings. Humanity just finds this new way, or perhaps it wasn't quite so sudden as we think, but they start experiencing themselves through art and with art, and art comes into the way we experience ourselves and the way we experience our lives. And the other day, I went to Chauvet Cave, not literally because you can't, it's sealed off, but this is the oldest example of cave art that we currently have. So I went there in the VR situation, which is incredibly immersive, and it really does feel like you're there. How it works, you start down by the side of a river, and there's a massive arch, like a natural eroded arch that goes over the river. The river's in a valley, and you can see why people would have met here, because it's just a great landmark, a great imposing landmark. And you go up into the cave, and you're standing there, and it feels, if you're familiar with what it feels like to step into a cave, it feels the same doing it in VR, because all those memories are coming back. It's a very rich sensory experience. You're stepping in out of the daylight world into the cave, and it's dark and it's cool and the air is different. And in the simulation, just as it would have been for our upper late Paleolithic man, it's all candlelit, well, not candlelit, firelit. So you have a brazier or something that you're holding in your hand. So the inside of the cave feels red, looks red, and it's the ceiling's quite low, and there's these huge stalagmites coming down. No, tights coming down, mites going up. That's it. You're enclosed in this strange, feeling very sacred space. And there's art on the walls, and the art's amazing because it's art depicting creatures that don't exist anymore. There's like woolly rhinos and all sorts of strange animals. And right there in the center, there's a sort of square-shaped rock with a cave bear skull placed on it. And the anthropologists think that was placed there deliberately as a kind of altar. So you're walking into this space, and a cave bear, right? It sounds like a mythological animal, but they were real, they were huge, they were terrifying. I met one in VR. It's part of the simulation. So you keep going in, as you imagine yourself as the late Paleolithic person, you keep going in deeper and deeper into this cave, and you go up and down a little corridor, and then around, and at this point there's no natural light anymore. You're really deep, deep, deep in the cave in the darkness, and you shimmy up and you climb over a bit that's slippery, and then you're there in a corner, and that's where you choose to create your artwork, and you painstakingly scrape away the outer layer of the cave wall to reveal the limestone beneath, and then you scrape in your little, and perhaps it's an animal, perhaps it's just a sort of a little shape, a mysterious sigil that you're scraping in, and who knows what those mean or what they are. So that anthropologists look at this, what they call deep art, the art that's deep within the cave, and they think that there's something non-artistic, I guess, like it's not just like a gallery piece, right? Because if it was a gallery piece, you put it on the main cave wall where everyone can see. There's something strange about this. Only one person can look at it. It's very hard to find. Why would people create art like this? What are they up to? And the explanation that the anthropologists come up with is that they are doing something like ritual. And this makes perfect sense to me, because I'm an artist as well as a ritualist, so I draw and I sculpt, and I know that feeling of coming into contact with something strange, bringing all your attention onto one thing to create something. It's artists will often describe it, they talk about being inspired by the muse, right? Because there's something where you absent yourself and you let something come through, which sounds a lot like what people describe shamans doing. They often say shamans were the first artists. And in the shamanic practitioner community, I guess, they talk about the idea of becoming a hollow bone for spirit and letting something flow through. Flow is obviously like a psychological explanation for what's going on. That's where you're in a deep flow state when you're creating art, and you're in a deep flow state if you're doing it right in ritual. And the way I create art is the same way I create ritual. I go into that state. I'm not mapping anything out in an analytical way. I am connecting with the person and then seeing what emerges through myself and through us. So I think the idea of ritual as art is very moving to me. They have the same origins, and I feel like they work in a similar way. There's a similar process going on when we create art as when we create ritual and when we are in ritual. If you think about this idea that the anthropologists have about art being something very important about what makes us human, I think obviously the same could be said for ritual. I think ritual made us human in many ways, and it can help us stay human. So if we come back to that quote that I started this section with about art, let's reword it and see what you think. Ritual is what defines us, what makes us human. And again, I'd love to hear how you guys are responding to this in the chat. I can't read it as we go, but I'll read it all later. I'd love to hear if anyone feels like that's true, or if how that resonates with you, the idea that ritual is art. Okay, my next metaphor. Let's see what you think of this one. Ritual is a container. And I've got a little explanatory quote for this as well, from Helen Dunmore, an amazing British poet and artist, novelist, in fact. And she's talking about her art form. And she says, a novel in the end is a container, a shape which you're trying to pour your story into. The idea of ritual as a container came to me from one of my ritual clients, from Jonathan. I don't know if he's here today, but if he is, hi. He asked me specifically to create a container for him. That's the words he used. And when we created ritual together, he wanted something for self-transformation. And this idea of ritual as a container is very, very appealing to me. So last weekend on Sunday, I went to witness my first Eucharist, my first Roman Catholic Mass. I grew up atheist. I've never had an experience like this before, but I thought it's an important ancient ritual. I should be there. I should witness it to have a greater understanding of this particular ritual and ritual in general. I did actually have a boyfriend when I was a teenager who was a Eucharistic minister, but I never made it to any of his gigs. So this was all new to me, and it was amazing. I mean, many of you will be familiar with this, of course, but the smell of the incense, the stained glass windows. This is the tallest church in England that I went to, and the scenes just go on forever. And you can imagine the acoustics are fantastic. And I saw people, I can't take the Eucharist, obviously, because I'm not baptized, but I saw people moving up to the central aisle towards the priest to take that sacrament. And there was one woman actually who caught my eye. She was stepping very deliberately, like one foot in front of the other, like this, and just very gracefully. And there was almost like a sense of her being pulled towards this moment where she would ingest the host. It was really very moving. And the reason why, well, one of the many reasons why I find myself there witnessing the Eucharist is because earlier this year, on the recommendation of my friend Nathan, I read this amazing book called The Immortality Key. And I'm not an ancient historian. I haven't checked any of the facts in it. But what it did is gave me a brilliant explanation for this idea of ritual as a container, because this guy argues that, like the early Paleo-Christians, where they were in the basements in Rome, like sharing the sacrament, the Eucharistic meal, and it was usually women administering this meal. And it was very, it was very secret, and it often turned into a bit of a party. Before that, even the earliest Christian use of the Eucharist, this guy argues that there were the cults of Dionysus, for example, who were doing similar things. They started as mystery cults and they came into people's homes. And then even before that, there were the Eleusinian mysteries, where they consumed this sacred drink as part of a ritual to experience the descent of Persephone, and that whole story of Persephone and Demeter, and yeah, that amazing myth. And then he even stretches it back even further into prehistory, back to the sort of cave painting times that I was talking about earlier. And he talks about this idea of graveyard beer, which is something that he thinks happened, or many people think happened, in places like Göbekli Tepe, where people would drink this perhaps hallucinogenic, perhaps psychedelic brew that would take them into the other world, just so they could see their family, their loved ones off who had died, almost like you know, you go to the station and then you go to the platform to say goodbye. So taking that little drugged drink to get you to the platform of death, almost to see them off, walking them to their train. And this idea, this ritual, the ritual where you make a drink divine, and then you drink it and you yourself ingest the divine and become divine. This is an old ritual. It's a ritual that's contained many myths. Currently, the one that I witnessed last Sunday, it was containing that myth, you know, of Jesus, and this is my body, this is my blood, etc. But perhaps it will contain other myths in the future. And that's one of the features of ritual that is so powerful, the way it can contain myths for us. And of course, one of the beautiful things about containers is that they allow the opportunity, I guess, for transformation within them, like an alchemist's flask, right? You can have two completely different elements, many completely different elements, and you put them in there in that container, and it holds space for transformation, which is what Jonathan came to me looking for, a space to be held for transformation, and that's what ritual gave him. So I think ritual holds myths, personal myths in Jonathan's case, like you know, the story that he tells himself about himself, the story that we all tell ourselves about ourselves, and the opportunity for transformation there is, of course, you can rewrite that story through ritual. So rituals hold myths, and then the myths hold us as individuals and as communities of faith in the case of the Eucharist, or communities, you know, wider communities, these big rituals we have, like at Christmas. Many people across the Western world and further afield will be celebrating Christmas, and it's holding a myth that is beyond just, you know, the Christian myth nowadays. So ritual as a container, how does that sound? Let's reword Helen Dunmore's quote. A ritual, in the end, is a container, a shape which you're trying to pour your story into. It works, doesn't it? I mean, I'd love to know what you think. As I say, maybe you could vote which of these metaphors you find most compelling. Be interesting. Okay, metaphor 3. And this one isn't just mine. This one's one that, you know, those ritual boffins I was talking about earlier, the ritual studies people, they use this too. Ritual is a language. So to get some clarity on what I mean and they mean when they say language, I'll turn to Wittgenstein. He said, the limits of my language mean the limits of my world. So I think what he's pointing to there is the fact that language isn't just this passive tool that we use. It's not just something we do. It's something that affects us and affects the world through us. So about like 150,000 years ago, humans co-opt this mechanism that we have in our throats and our faces for eating and breathing, and start using it to communicate vocally. And then, like, we're off to the races. Everything starts going from there. That's where opportunities for developing culture in a way that other animals that don't have this technology can't. It's one of the things, like art, it's one of the things that make us human. And it's not just, as I say, this tool that we use, it is also affecting us. There's a feedback loop there. So obviously there's just this bunch of random data, sense data, that's coming at us all the time, and all these things that I can see, like you know, there's a window, there's a Christmas tree, there's my cats, just stuff, right? And I use language to parcel that out and understand it so I can interact with the world. And that's what we do as human beings. So that's a way that language affects the world, because the way we act upon the world is influenced by the language we use. But it's also affecting the way we think about the world by squaring things off and putting things in categories, sometimes not for the, not for the best. And it's affecting our the meat in our head, like literally how that's constructed. And there's fascinating studies about the history of brain development, how that relates to language, and the meat in our head and the electricity that moves around it. So just like there's this flow of sense data that we make sense of with language, there's also this flow of time. And we use language to make sense of time as well. We talk about the present moment, the future, the past. We orient ourselves in time through language. But we also orient ourselves in time through ritual. And this is really important to me because I have sort of seasonal observances that I make throughout the year. I mean, every religious person, I don't know if I call myself a religious person, but every person who's involved in any kind of faith tradition, even those who are not, there are lots of secular observances that we make throughout the year to measure out time, to punctuate time. So it's not just this intimidating, endless stream. For example, in Christianity, you have the liturgical year, obviously Christmas when Christ is born, and then Easter when he dies, and there's probably loads of other stuff too, but that's not my area. My area is what neo-pagans and Wiccans call the wheel of the year. So this is the year divided up into 8 segments. If you imagine the year as a wheel. We celebrate the solstices and the equinoxes and the cross-quarter days in between. So when you're on this wheel, about every 6 weeks, you're celebrating some kind of festival. So then there are associated rituals. And I started doing this, obviously, as a teenager, as a teen witch. I didn't even give it up during my rationalist days because I was like, it's the solstices and the equinoxes. They're literal astronomical events. Even Richard Dawkins couldn't blame me for celebrating such things, I told myself, and I kept it up. And then I've obviously reignited that part of my ritual practice as I've come back to it a little less self-consciously lately. Just to give you a flavour. So we're coming up to the winter solstice now. And this time running up to the winter solstice is when it gets the darkest, like the nights are the longest. And there's this feeling in me of a kind of weird exhilaration, like the kind of exhilaration you get when someone you love dies, that weird, like there's nothing left to lose feeling that comes upon me this time of year, and it comes every year. And this is part of how I've developed my personal wheel of the year. So I'm basing it on the Wiccan and the sort of neo-pagan thing, but I've been journaling for years on these days and discovered things about myself which play into the rituals that I enact. So on the winter solstice, I will do a ritual which will be an ultimate turning inwards ritual and a finding there in the middle of the darkness some kind of hope. Because, of course, the day after the winter solstice, the days start getting longer. And at my longitude, that's a big deal. And then we start to come back up, back into the light through a sort of period of dreaming. And there's a ritual around dreaming and the imaginal. And then up spring equinox, stepping over that threshold into the light half of the year, through to May Eve, which is one of my favorites. That's the celebrations are all around sex, and if you want to do ritual at that time, then it's going to get sexy because the world outside is doing that. We have animals, birds and bees, etc., move through to the summer solstice, which here, these amazing long evenings, so it's a perfect time for a party, and lots of people go to Stonehenge at this time as well. The only time they let you touch the stones. And then background, a sort of season of Thanksgiving, I suppose, August, beginning of August, a season of atonement, and then back into the darker half of the year, and we get to Halloween, or Samhain, as it's called by witches and Wiccans, which is a time of sacrifice, where you let go of what you don't need before you descend into the dark. And I'm just taking you on that little journey to show you how much that shapes my life, because there are emotions that are brought up in me in response to these ritual observances and in response to the natural world. I'm just gesturing here because I have a big window here that you can't see, but the natural world out there outside the window. So this is a way in which time has been, as I say, punctuated by these festivals, and things make more sense to me, and I start to see everything. I know where I was this time last year, and I know what I was doing, and I know what I was feeling because I was doing this ritual. It's a very, very powerful feature of ritual technology. So I think the way in which ritual is like language is that it allows us to make sense of all this data that's coming at us, whether it's time or just sense data. Allows us to make sense of it, i.e. like render it intelligible, and it allows us to sense make, like to create meaning. And Byung-Chul Han said in his book, The Disappearance of Rituals, which was a brilliant little book on rituals, ritual renders time habitable. I love that. And language renders our universe habitable for us linguistic creatures. And ritual does the same job for time. So to return to Wittgenstein, see how this lands with you, see if this makes sense to you if I rephrase his quote. The limits of my rituals are the limits of my world. It's certainly true for me. Okay, onwards to our fourth metaphor. And this one's a bit abstract, but it might be my favorite. And that is, ritual is love. And I'll turn to Buckminster Fuller for a quote to illustrate this. He said, love is metaphysical gravity. So beautiful. I was introduced to this idea of ritual being love by another amazing ritual client and friend, Holly, who is here today. And she, when I asked her this question, when I was asking everyone this question, when I asked her this question, she said that ritual is a way of courting and falling in love with the world. And I told her that I was going to quote her in this presentation, and she made an addendum. She said, ritual is a way of courting and falling in love with the world and ourselves. It's beautiful. It feels so true. The reason why I think it resonated so deeply with me is that I've become a student of love. I mean, I guess we all are, aren't we? Like our whole lives. But explicitly, at the beginning of last year, a couple of my friends asked me to marry them, to perform their wedding, not to marry them. I'm already married to my best friend, but this, as a ritualist, this is a very exciting opportunity, right? It's the kind of archetypal ritual, the wedding ritual. We don't have many initiation rituals left in our culture, and like the Western culture anymore, but the wedding ritual, where you step in as two individual people and then you step out either as a husband or as a wife, it's kind of, it's not that different. Well, it's very different, but you know, there are similarities to an initiation ritual where you step in as a child and you step out as an adult. I think a lot of people experience it that way actually in our culture, because we don't have that adulting initiation ritual. So I'm really excited about performing this wedding, but I have a problem. And the problem is, here in the UK, there are two ways that you can marry people. You can marry people if you are a member of a religious organization, or if you work for the government. We don't have any of this, like you sign a form on the internet and you can do it, nothing like that. Those are the only two routes in. And that's fine. It doesn't need to be documented. It doesn't need to be official in that way. But both of these things, whether it's the religious organization, say the church traditionally, or the government, the celebrant, the person performing the ritual, is invoking a larger power than themselves. So in the religious case, they're obviously invoking the deity that they're into, and in the government case, they're invoking the state. So when they say, by the power vested in me by the church or by the government, I now pronounce you man and wife, or man and man, or wife and wife, or whatever it is. they have to invoke some greater power. And I'm thinking, what is this greater power that I will invoke to marry my friends? We tried out a few possibilities. We thought about maybe community. Maybe I could invoke the power of the community. Maybe I could be like a spokesperson for the community. But that didn't seem quite right, because their relationship is quite private. It's not going to be a big ceremony or anything. It's about them. It's between them, really. It's not really, presenting each other to their families or anything like that. So the community thing didn't feel right. They suggested the universe. I was like, whoa, it's a bit grandiose. I don't want to stand in for the whole universe. And also, I just don't have that relationship with the universe. I'm not one of these people who feels like they're in relationship with the universe in that way. Maybe one day, but not right now. It wouldn't feel honorable to take that on. And so we settled on, and maybe you'll think this is equally grandiose, but we settled eventually on the idea that I would be marrying them in the name of love. And I started studying love at that point and trying to figure out what this thing was that I was going to invoke and how I was going to invoke it. Because I feel to do this in a like to do this honestly, to do this fairly, to really be there and to conduct a ritual as myself, I would need to know what this thing called love was that was pulling through me, that I was, I was using. I don't know quite what the right word is. It's hard to find language around love. So I started looking into it. I read a lot of philosophy, and I did a lot of introspective thinking and journaling, and I talked to a lot of people. And I came to this idea that, and as Holly said, you fall in love. You fall in love with the world through ritual. You fall in love. Love isn't something we do so much. It's something it's a state that we find ourselves falling into. And I love that idea of momentum, that of falling in love, and the way it almost has its own logic. So of course, my analytical mind is like, but what is that logic? And this is what I came up with. There's this initial stage of love, which is crazy, where you're enchanted by the other person, and it's all just faith-based because you don't really know them, but you think they're wonderful and you think you can create something wonderful together. That's kind of your first stage. It's kind of like faith, I think. And then you sort of tumble into stage 2, which is the stage where you realize you're both very complicated people and try and figure out how that's going to work. And you have to make sacrifices, and you have to surrender. You have to surrender not just to each other, but to this momentum of love that's coming through you and between you. And then hopefully, if all goes well in stage 2, you find yourself falling right down to stage 3, which is the stage where you transform and become something more than the sum of your parts. And this is you can see this in wedding rituals. This is how wedding rituals are constructed. There's the groom standing there traditionally waiting for the bride. That's faith. He has faith she's going to turn up. Then there's the boring speeches. That's the sacrifice bit. And then there's the moment where you exchange rings, or your hands are tied together in a hand fasting tradition, and you become something different and something greater than you were individually. So this idea of ritual as love and love as ritual made perfect sense to me when I started thinking about it as a force, as metaphysical gravity. And so I'll rejig the Buckminster Fuller quote and see how it lands with you now with that context. Ritual is metaphysical gravity. Okay, so those are my 4 metaphors, and I choose metaphors specifically because I don't want to do that pinning things down anymore. I want to keep it loose and I want to keep it interesting. But I did promise you I'd try and find something like a definition before the end of this little talk. And that question, what is ritual, is still echoing. So I need to put it to bed somehow. And this is what I've come up with. Let's see if this sounds right to you. Maybe think about rituals that you've engaged in, and see if this sounds something like what ritual is to you. I think ritual is a binding agent. Bear with me, because it works for all 4 metaphors. So art binds the imaginal to the real, and that's the role of the artist, to bring their visions into actuality, to bind what's in their head, the subjective, and what's out there, the objective. Containers hold space for combination, and yes, combination has the same root as bind, and of course they bind us to our myths. Language binds us to reality with this weird feedback loop of making sense and sense making. And love, well, love obviously binds us together. And as I say, you see that literally in traditional wedding services with a hand fasting where people's hands are tied. So I love this. Ritual is a binding agent. It works by binding as well. What I mean is, in a ritual act, in that key ritual act, so in a wedding ritual, the key ritual act is a speech act where you say I do. It's not, when I say a speech act, I mean the speech isn't representative at that point. It's like I promise or I bet. The speech is usually representative. I'm usually describing something else, but when I say I promise, I bet, I do in the context of a wedding ritual, it is the action itself, and that's what ritual does. It binds what we're doing, like the movements we're making with our hands, the candles we're lighting, the words we're saying, with the thoughts in our heads and then a greater meaning or mythos. So ritual works by binding those things together in one key ritual act. And you'll usually find that at the center of most rituals, there will be a key ritual act that brings those threads together. And it works to bind. It binds communities together. It binds us to our ecosystems in the case of seasonal observances. And it binds us into coherent people. Like it takes all our disparate parts and brings them together in that moment. And that is one of the things that sort of personal development rituals that I do a lot of work with. And the other reason why I really like this definition, ritual is a binding agent, is a very personal one, because it speaks to my relationship with ritual. So my name, Rebecca, is from the Hebrew rivka, which means to bind or tie. So I literally could not have chosen a better name for myself as a ritual. And once I started conceptualizing ritual as a binding agent, it made sense. This ritual renaissance that we're experiencing, or that I'm experiencing, made sense. Because what is a better antidote to atomization than binding? What do we need more right now than a binding agent? You know, we're atomized in like, we're separated from our environment, separated from each other, we're kind of fragmented within ourselves into all these little, you know, portioned up identity categories that people can sell us things. There's a need in us, I think, that is calling ritual back up out of the darkness, out of our deepest history. And it's something that is so natural to humans that we will just start doing it without even thinking about it, because we need form, we need something to hold us. But I'm not into convincing you that you need ritual, or that the world needs ritual, or anything like that. My work is not motivated by altruism. I'm not trying to save the world or solve it. That was the old me. I'm just experiencing this weird, strange, mysterious, and really like beautiful is the only word I can think of it, this force of ritual, because it makes me feel whole. I don't even know exactly what that means or what it will look like if I keep going down this path, but that's where I'm headed. And if you guys relate, if you have this same or similar story of going from naive belief, no belief, nuanced belief, if you're there in that little microcosm of a bigger journey that our culture are doing, then perhaps it will help you too. And if you are feeling that, if that makes sense to you, if you're in the same place as me, crossing that bridge, then I'll leave you with some words that I found really comforting from T.S. Eliot, a man who went through his own massive epistemic shifts in his lifetime, from a set of poems actually concerned with the passing of the seasons and the passing of time. So this is from 4 quartets, Little Gidding, and I'm sure it'll be familiar to many of you. We shall never cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. Thank you.
Awesome. Let's give Rebecca a round of applause, everyone. Great job, Rebecca. I think you ritual pilled the whole stoa, so thank you for that. And how would you like to proceed now? Would you like to do some Q&A?
Yeah, please. I'd love to hear questions, particularly practical questions would be great, because I know I've gone a bit abstract and kind of rambly. So any practical questions anyone has, or any questions about ritual, the theory of ritual, or their experience of ritual, I'd really love to hear them. And thank you all so much for listening to me. I do consider that kind of like a weird little devotional. So it's good to get it off my chest.
So if anyone has any questions, raise your hand or put them in the chat. I'll riff on one to warm up the stoa. Yeah, I really like this, your definition, ritual as a binding agent. And my mind is turning to your practice as a ritual artist. And even in my kind of practice, Socrates is here meowing at me. So he says hi. I'm recommending rituals to people. And I feel like it's like, oh, this is the thing to do. And it's almost like when I imagine people come to you, and definitely people come to me, there's like disintegration process that they're going through in
Yeah.
their lives. And something about offering a ritual is like a reintegration into a greater whole.
Yes.
And it seems like the artistry of ritual allows for, like, if you have your own ritual intelligence or skill set, allows for this sort of like reintegration process yourself if you can design a ritual. So I'm curious how that framing landed for you, that disintegration to reintegration via ritual as a binding agent.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense to me. It makes me think of the stages of alchemy, which go through nigredo, which is like a dissolution, albedo, so nigredo is black, obviously. Albedo is white, which is like a purification, and then rubedo, which is a becoming. And I see this three. I love things that come in threes. I'm really partial to things that come in threes. This three-stage process of disintegration, purification, and then becoming, coming alive. I see that in almost every ritual. I certainly, and when I don't do it intentionally necessarily, but I see that pattern. It's like an emergent pattern that happens. So yeah, you're right. The ritual holds people whilst they go through that process. But the process isn't just disintegration and reintegration. I think a process of purification, like sloughing off all the crap, has to happen whilst you're in that container of the ritual. If you're doing this kind of transformative ritual, obviously there are other types of rituals, but that's the ones that people come to me for, and the ones that I love to create as well. Although, I don't know, I feel like maybe even in like a like one that isn't necessarily intended to transform, still has some kind of transformative quality. And like a lot of the ritual studies people will say this too, that even if it's just like a celebration, when you step out of celebrating, for example, if you have like a seasonal celebration, celebrating the solstice or like the summer solstice, and you go up to Stonehenge and you rave away with your mates, and you come out as a different person, there is something transformative that happens, even though you're not necessarily, like, that's not your intention, but having that experience changes you. Having any experience changes you, but especially those intense experiences where, as I say, you know, action, thought, and meaning are pulled together. There's almost something inevitably transformative about that, and that happens in most rituals, but not in what a lot of people refer to as rituals, like, you know, having a cup of tea, maybe. So I one of the struggles with this defining ritual thing is I don't want to define, you know, having a morning cup of coffee as a ritual. I want to keep it set aside as something sacred and special. And yeah, I recognize there's a very blurry line.
Jonathan Harris, when he did the life art, he said that the routines are sort of like a binding for character every day. Cool. So if you have any questions, pop in the chat. We won't go in exact order, but Shay, you had a question.
Hi, Shay.
Thank you so much. This has just been so uplifting and affirming and exciting. I was wondering for yourself, when you first started the ritual building practice, how did you find the ritual personal for you?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So it's difficult because I started creating rituals when I was so young, when I was a teenager. So it's hard to like project myself back and remember what it was like as a teenage witch. But I remember there used to be these big books of rituals that I would look through. And as soon as I started looking through them, there were things that, okay, so this is very inspired by sort of Western esotericism, very high magic stuff, and they're asking you to get out your wand and your you know, all these ritual tools that I didn't have as a teenager. So immediately I'm starting to improvise, and then I'm starting to improvise around the language as well, which felt unfamiliar in my mouth, and I start improvising around the concepts. And by the time I've put, you know, all these different elements through my own lens, I basically have my own ritual. So I think that's actually a really good place to start with looking at a ritual. I mean, you can find them on my Substack. Look at those rituals, go through them, and find the bits that you want to change and create your own. And the most important thing to being able to create your own rituals is, and this is another way in which ritual is like art, but I just didn't have time to mention all the ways, is being familiar with your own symbolic language, which might be very similar to your culture's symbolic language, or it might be quite idiosyncratic. But there are associations that you personally will have with fire, with snakes, with I don't know, I'm just looking around around my room with all sorts of things. There are your own associations, and you can find these by just journaling, by just choosing a random item and then journaling about it, or by paying attention to your dreams and noticing the things that come up again and again. You're like, oh, that obviously means that's resonant to me for some reason. Let's find out what that reason is. Or by looking at the literature that you enjoyed, especially the literature you enjoyed as a child. You'll find stuff there, and just building up basically like a symbolic dictionary. And then when you're reading a ritual or creating your own ritual from scratch, either way, you'll know the things that make you feel a certain way, because they will be part of that symbolic dictionary that you've built up. And I mean, you already have it inside you. All you have to do is do a little bit of introspection and start writing it down, and you'll find those things that come up. And then they're like the ingredients in your pantry that you can start playing with.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Right, so Sahil has a question that he wants me to read on his behalf. So this has been chasing me for a very long time without clear resolution. Why must rituals be weaved out of poetry instead of rationality? Or at least, why do they seem to be stickier and more successful that way?
It's a really good question. And I don't know, basically, but I have some ideas. So when I first started talking about this, about getting into creating rituals for other people, when I started to sort of like, go public with this thing that I've been doing for a while, I was talking to Peter about it, and he was like, oh, I'm sure you'll figure out a model for creating ritual, and that'd be great because you can present it to us. And I was like, yeah, I'll make a model for creating ritual. And I really didn't create a model. I mean, I have ideas about structure, and I have ideas, and they're all over the place, but I never created that definitive model. And other people have. There are people who work, they call themselves ritual designers, and they've created models for, and if you're interested in exploring that, then there's the ritual design toolkit, which is very interesting. It's literally a model, and you slot in your ideas to how to create ritual. But I think you're right. I think they are less sticky. And I think it is because rituals have this strange multivalent quality. There is stuff going on that you don't know why it's there. So my experience of going to witness the Eucharist, for example, I couldn't understand a lot of what they were saying because they were singing and stuff. But what I really want to do is to go, and they're like, not just singing, but there's like this weird oratory tone that they do that I'm not familiar with. So it's hard for me to follow along. I want to go to a Latin mass because Latin mass, obviously I wouldn't understand any of it, so I'd just be seeing the form. And there is something important about that. There's something important about there being features in your ritual that you don't understand. And I think it must be something about forcing your brain out of its normal patterns into this new odd pattern that is confronting and makes it more salient than if it just all made sense to you perfectly. So I'm a real fan of, if something weird comes up in a discussion, like if I'm discussing with a client a ritual that we're creating together, and something odd comes up, a little symbol or something, I will try and weave that in, especially if we don't understand what it is, because I think it's those things that like knock you off edge and signal to your brain, okay, now we're doing something strange and important and powerful. So I think that's something like what it is, but I basically don't know. But I agree with you, it's definitely true that rituals that are produced through poetry and through kind of intuition are more powerful than the ones produced using the ritual toolkit. Although, I mean, many people have lots of success with that, so I'm not to criticize too much. But I do think there is a distinct difference between what they do, ritual design, which is often aimed at making you feel a certain way about product, like designing the way those Apple boxes, that's patented and they call it a ritual, the way the box slides open and the paper crinkles and all that stuff. That's ritual design. And I consider myself a ritualist, which, I mean, yeah, I think it's an important difference. And I think the sort of ritual work that I do is probably more powerful personally, although I don't think I'm ever going to get, a contract for Apple doing it the way I do it. So, swings and roundabouts.
All right. Nathan, you had a question.
Yeah. Hey, Rebecca.
Hey.
I just kind of want to see if you can go into like doing your art as a ritual, and if you actually see it as that, then there's some times where you're just doing art for the enjoyment versus doing it, as like something that you're pushing everything away and like taking the time to integrate that into something that you see, that feels like a ritual? Like the
Yeah, for sure. I have like 3 modes, I guess. Mode 1 is I'm doing illustration work for someone else, in which case I'm working to a brief. I love doing that work. I find it, challenging and exciting, but I'm not entering that same sort of sacred state when I do that work. Or very rarely, maybe by accident. I often listen to podcasts while I do that kind of work. My brain is thinking about other stuff and I'm just trusting, my years of experience of drawing to guide me through, hopefully. And then I have drawing for fun, as you said, or practice. And that's just, it's completely unconscious. It has no framing. It's just that I will often go into a studio and do life drawing in that way. Just pop in, draw whoever's in front of me, and then leave, and that's that. And then I have ritual art creation, which is a whole different thing, and which I will be very deliberate about. If music is a big part of my rituals, and this was a massive movement actually for me. So if anyone who's thinking about developing their own ritual practice, and you find music moving, use it. For God's sake, use it. It's so powerful. You don't have to be sitting there silently. Find the music that corresponds to the emotions you want to feel, the state you want to get into, and then make yourself a playlist and listen to it. And that's what I do. So I'll light candles. I might say I have a sort of, I don't even know what, a poem, I suppose, that I've written that orients myself about who I am as an artist and what I value and what I'm trying to do. And yeah, I often light candles just for the smell and that experience. That it's like they're like gateways into ritual, right? And one of the gateways might be reading that poem, and another gateway might be lighting the candle. And then at some point, my brain's like, "Oh, we're doing this now," and I'm in, and I go into that kind of flow state, and I create just like really weird stuff, weird, exciting art that makes me feel alive. And that experience of creating that art is the art. Like the actual thing that I create doesn't matter to me. Getting into that state and experience that state is the art form. And I can't really explain that logically, but that's just how I feel about it. And then on the other end of it, there's a similar sort of thing of coming back into reality, coming out of that strange state back into reality. And I didn't always create art this way. This is something that has been like the last couple of years. I've realized how I can trigger my brain into a ritual state, and I've started to experiment it with art, and it's really taken my, I was going to say it's taken my art to a new level. It's taken it to some weird places, let's just say. Weird, exciting places. I love it. Yeah. Thank you. Good question.
Any follow-up, Nathan?
Not too much. I can just, like, when you started talking about like that being like sort of the purpose of it, like that's the thing. Like while you're doing it and you feel it, like then that seems to be the purpose. Like, that's the art. The
Yes.
feeling,
Yeah.
it's all kind of tied together. I can completely relate. Like
Yeah. Exactly. And dance is one of the best art forms to try for this, because there is no product unless you're recording yourself, I guess. But I would never record myself dancing. That would be foolish. So yeah.
All right. So if you have questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. And I'll sneak in another question. Actually, I'll share something and then I'll follow up with a question. So I went on a road trip with my friend Lubomir, good friend Lubomir, to Montreal this weekend. And we were both kind of ill prepared for the trip. We're coming in with like your own stuff. And I said, you know what, let's just do a little ritual before we go on the road trip. And so we just took out, we did a writing exercise, a mini journal exercise, where we wrote down all the stuff we wanted to let go before going on the road. And then we burnt that. And then we wrote down like some values we want to commit to. And I think the key one, we wrote down a living question, a question we want to live with during the 4 days we're on the road together. And mine was how to be a better spiritual brother. And the trip was like so nourishing, and it was enchanted. We just had these amazing conversations. We met some friends, strangers, and it was beautiful. And I attributed that to the enchantment to that ritual and living with that question. And it was such a little move, it was like a 10-minute exercise, but it just made the trip. And just encountering you and our conversations and doing rituals and stuff, I really want to get good at this. I really want to get good at like being a ritual artist. And we were talking about perhaps doing a course or experience or something like that that affords these capacities. So my question to you, Rebecca, and perhaps people in the room is, how do we get really, really, really good at this art?
Well, I've already given you like the first thing I would say is start paying attention to your symbolic world and the symbolic world of your culture if you're going to create rituals for other people. That's super important because that's your ingredients for that you're going to be working with. So there are two other things that come to mind straight off the bat. One is the creation of sacred space. So I don't necessarily mean literal sacred space. I don't mean physical space, although it could be, and that is an important skill to have. You need to know what kind of space. So like I was describing stepping into the cave and stepping into the Catholic Church, there is something that changes within you when you step into that space, and the creation of sacred space is something that you can do, and it's something that is very big in like the Western occult tradition. You know, you've seen magicians with drawing circles and chalk around them on the floor, or yeah, whatever. Establishing here is a space in which the outside world does not matter. All that matters is me bringing all the elements together within myself to have this experience. And when I say the elements, I mean action, thought, and meaning. Although maybe the cardinal, you know, earth, air, fire, and water, if that's your thing as well. But yeah, so you're creating a container. Got to keep coming back to that language to hold those things. So knowing how to do that for yourself is really important. The way you learn how to do that is you experiment. You try drawing a circle on the floor. You try lighting a candle. You try turning the lights off. You try everything that seems like it might be a good thing or that people are doing in other traditions until the one that makes you light up, and it'll be different for all of us, that makes you. I would suggest starting with creating a circle, whether that's with a piece of rope or a ring of candles, whatever. And then the other element of sacred space is the headspace. So it's kind of like the psychedelic guys say, set and setting. You've got your setting, which is your literal set, and then your mind set. And again, this will be different for everyone, but you need to be able to get into this slightly altered state. There are kind of two ways that I can think of to get into it, and one is to go up and the other is to go down. To go down, that would be relaxing your body, deep meditation, clearing your mind, you know, lying down on the floor, letting everything go. Going up would be some kind of excitatory exercise. So frenetic dancing, drumming, chanting, singing, like bringing your energy and blood up until you're like super hyped. Either way, once you're in that state, you're in the kind of the mindset, the headspace. That's the sacred headspace, I guess, in which you can commit your ritual act. Oh, commit sounds bad, doesn't it? But you can, yeah, you can make your ritual act happen. So you've got your dictionary of symbols that you've created for yourself. You've got your way of getting into sacred space. And then the third thing is just experience. You have to go and do as many rituals as possible. You have to make up your own and just do them. You have to go to my Substack and just do them. You have to go to your local church and do it, just like, because that's how you learn. This sort of thing is like language, right? You learn by participating in it. You can't learn by just reading about it in books. You have to, and then the form sort of starts to, I don't know, it gets into you, and you'll find yourself making movements in ritual that are following a shape that you're not even aware is there because you've ingested it subconsciously because you've experienced so much ritual. So those are my three like top tips. And then the other thing is writing down what you're going to do before you do it. It's just really sensible, because you don't want to be distracted by thinking about what you're going to do next or what the next moves you're going to make. So once you have those three elements together, then you just write out, and it could be really simple. And I would suggest starting with three things: establish sacred space, make a ritual act, which could be as simple as lighting a candle, tying a knot. I don't know, it could be anything really, as long as you're there, as long as you're present. And then exiting sacred space. 3 steps, write them down, and then just do them and trust yourself, trust those steps that you've written down, and let yourself kind of step to one side and let whatever this weird thing called ritual is flow through you and see what happens, and keep notes. And the things that work, keep doing them, because the more you do them, they become habitual. And in a way, that's one of the ways that ritual gains great power. When you've done a ritual a certain number of times, and then you find yourself making the movements without even thinking about it, and your hands are doing these things, you're like, yeah, I'm here. I'm here and I'm not here. Strange paradox. I think that's where I'd start if I were you guys.
And the follow-up question there is kind of like on the trigger of the ritual, or the ritual trigger. In your practice, you're like forming an informal taxonomy of the reasons why people come to you and trigger their desire for a ritual. Like, the obvious ones, like making a decision or letting go of something. And I imagine some are more difficult to do well, and maybe some are easier. So any recommendations on good, like the trigger of a ritual, the content of a ritual, good ones to start with?
Oh yeah, okay. I mean, it could be literally anything, but I think a transformation that you want to make. So if you're like, I'm in, say, I worked with a ritual, actually the last one I published on my Substack was about exiting a codependent relationship. And it was created for a client who was, had just broken up with someone. It's a terrible relationship. And they needed to sort of take back those tendrils of, I don't even know how to describe it, those that connection to that person. They wanted to feel sovereign in themselves again. They didn't want to feel the connection and the constant worrying about what the person thought and all that stuff that goes with those sort of horrible breakups. So she had a really clear idea of where she is now, all tied up in this shit, and where she wanted to be, free of it. Anything like that, where you're like, I'm here and I want to be here. That's a great opportunity for ritual. And obviously you can't just do it with ritual. There's work you have to do in the mundane world often, but if you have an idea of a state of consciousness that you want to shift to another state of consciousness, that's a really good candidate. So letting go is a great one. I feel like I'm holding to these things, I want to let them go. Shifting your mood is a brilliant idea, like ritual idea. I'm feeling down, I'm feeling tired and I want to feel up, I want to feel energetic, or I'm feeling like up here anxious, and I want to come down. Anything like that. Shifting states, I think, is probably one of the best ways to start ritual. Another way you could go at it is to look at things that have less weight on them. So you could think about rituals of celebration, which are quite nice to begin with, because there's no you never feel like you've failed because you've done it, right? You've danced around, you've celebrated, whatever the thing is. So if there's something that you love, that you want to formally announce your love and affection for, or someone, or some feline creature in your life that you want to, you could ritualize that announcement of affection for that thing, whether it is the moon or, or your cat, as I say. That might also be a good opportunity. Yeah.
And when you mentioned the codependency, I put ritual as a boundary agent, to play off of your ritual. And Holly mentioned the chat, you gotta perhaps create boundaries to bind. So I'm curious what you think about the boundary work aspect that ritual can be of service to.
Yeah, I think that's one of the really big traditional forms of ritual in this kind of esoteric tradition. So in the old grimoires, they call it warding, and you literally do a ritual action at each of the portals into your home, like all of the doors, maybe all of the windows. And this is obviously, perhaps not so obviously, it's a metaphorical expression of creating those boundaries, saying you can't come in, you can't come in here, you can't come in here, you can't come in here. So the creating boundaries, and it also goes with creating sacred space as well. Creating sacred space is creating a boundary within which, and there's all sorts of traditions. A circle of salt, for example, is good for creating a boundary. And all of these type of things, I think you can use them. If you find a ritual that sounds completely mad in an old book with weird, suspiciously satanic looking illustrations, the tea-stained paper or whatever, and it's all about how to ward off the devil, I think you can use that to ward off literally any negative force. And because of the way that I see ritual, I don't necessarily think there's any kind of supernatural thing going on, although do flirt with the sacred. But I think you can use it to ward off, I love that word, warding, to ward off your own tendency in a way to overextend yourself, because that's often what we're drawing boundaries around, saying, no, stop, you have to be you have to look after yourself first. And that boundary isn't necessarily to act in any kind of like, aggressive way to push away other people, but to tell yourself, to tell a story to yourself about who you are. I am the sort of person who does not let people overstep. I'm the sort of person who makes sure I'm okay before I offer to help someone else. All of those sort of things. You can tell yourself those stories, and that's a way of creating a boundary. And obviously stories are just words. Stories with ritual action, that's when like something deep within this mess of meat starts really listening. So I say get out your salt shakers. That's my advice for anyone who uses boundaries.
Thank you for that, Rebecca. Holly, you had a share.
Hi, Rebecca and everyone. I'm so glad you're here. So glad we're doing this. It feels so good. Yeah, something like really popped when you were talking about ritual as container. And then I was thinking about the body as container and thinking about designing ritual of like really letting the body take the lead in that. So like what do I want to touch? Like, what do I want to feel? What do I want to smell? What do I want to hear? What do I want to taste? And having that be a really good guide to whatever it is you're trying to elicit. And also just thinking about having fun with it too, of like, especially if it's this sort of falling in love with yourself, like what can I do to just do something that's playful and is sort of a creative act of love that will feel good for other and feel good for self. They go hand in hand. And some of the things that I've been doing is just taking kind of some of those more mundane day-to-day stuff, like taking out the compost and then turning that into sort of like a love letter to nature and recycling. And so when I do that, I go and I give thanks. I mean, I have a big space out here, so I can just put the compost by a tree. And so that also being a way of starting with ritual, like sometimes it can feel, I think, overwhelming to try to like sort out a bunch of stuff. And so starting with stuff I've just been doing day to day and then making that like into something a little bit more meaningful.
Yeah, I love those questions. What do I want to taste? What do I want to smell? That's I'll add that to my suggestions. Steal that and add it to my suggestions of how to start off with ritual, because you can there's a guy, I think he founded the Satanic Church, Anton LaVey, and he talks about the idea of total environment. So his idea is, if you want to get into that brain space for ritual magic, that's what he's up to, you need to be looking at the right things, you need to be hearing the right things, you need to be smelling the right things. Everything needs to align, so everything needs to prompt whatever emotional state you want to get into. So yeah, that's really, really good. Sensory input is a very important element of ritual, and it's worth taking that time to do that introspection. So for example, I use frankincense a lot in my personal rituals, and I was telling someone about this and they were like, well, obviously, because it's what they burn in church. I was like, I never went to church. I don't know why it's got that association for me, but it does. So find those associations, and you might dig through your childhood to find them, or you might just find them at random when you're out, at some hippie shop sniffing all the different incense. It's like, oh, this one smells like power to me. I'm taking this home. That's going to be good. That combined with a circle of salt, and you're away. Yeah, and the other thing about ritual being playful and coming from the body, that was one of the metaphors that I was really wanted to bring to you, but I didn't have time or space. Ritual is play. It's so true. It has to be fun, because otherwise you just stop and get bored. Like, there has to be an element of joy coming through it. I mean, obviously sometimes rituals are difficult, but the creation of them and like the experience of them has to have the sort of looseness of play. I mean, it's like serious play. One of my amazing ritual clients, but I can't remember who, I ask people how silly they're willing to get, because like, as we've been discussing, you need something that tells your brain, oh, we're doing something odd here, which means you often have to do something odd. And also, you don't value things you don't pay for. And often the payment is you're going to look a bit silly whilst you're doing this, whether it's like, I don't know, singing to the sea, which is something I have been known to do occasionally and been caught doing by passers-by, or whatever it is, dancing in a doorway. She said, I'm prepared to get seriously silly. I was like, yes, that's it. that's what ritual is. It's seriously silly. And that idea of serious play and serious silliness, I think, yeah, is really important. So yeah, you have to have a kind of lightness about it. And and this is why I'm so reluctant to do this whole ritual is going to save the world, ritual is going to solve the meaning crisis, etc., etc. It's a tempting route to go down, but then it loses its lightness. Then there's something, I'm almost trying to instrumentalize it in a way I don't want to do. I just want it to be this thing that I'm in relationship with, as I said. So yeah, and what do you do with things you're in relationship with? You play with them. So yeah, thank you. That's great.
Thank you, Holly. Kevin, are you still here? Yeah. Would you like to ask your question?
Hi.
Hey.
So I was wondering about this. It made me think about the idea of ritual as some kind of container for karma, or I don't know where that leads. I mean, all the different places it leads, but basically how that relates to what might happen going forward, because it seems like there's a connection there.
That's interesting. What it makes me think of is those really ancient rituals, right? And one of the things that's so powerful about them, the mystery of them, is that you are following actions that someone like way back in history prescribed for you, and they've just been passed down through generations and generations and generations, and now you are here doing those movements and maybe even saying words that you don't fully understand. There's lots of traditions where they will deliberately use nonsense words or words in a language that they don't understand. So there's something about that, like, I mean, I don't know if this is exactly karma, but the idea of something being passed down through this chain that eventually gets to you, and then you have the opportunity to step into it and to do that weird brain flip where you become so present that you're absent because everything has been decided for you. So there's this kind of inevitability to it, this kind of fated nature to it. And then I guess going forward, thinking like, I have this odd, I have this odd sensation often when I'm celebrating a specific seasonal event that I am in the same place as I was last year doing the same things. There's like this weird breakdown of time. It's very odd. So I see that, and maybe if I was part of a bigger religious tradition, I would feel that collectively with the other people, and I would feel like maybe when those people are taking the Eucharist, especially that woman who was moving so gracefully up to the front, maybe she feels like she is one with the people who did the Paleo Christians who were taking the Eucharist. But I just have that on a personal level. And so there's something very pleasing about the fact that, you know, when I'm a wise old crone, hopefully I'll be wise, I will be able to step into myself at my age now, and at my teenage witch age when she first did her first rituals, and there'll be some weird kind of communication there. So it's kind of like, I'm really like at the edge of what I believe and what I think when talking about karma, but maybe there's something there, something about like a communication between the past and the present and learning from each other, and potentially sending forward ideas that we want to manifest. I don't know. I would love you to explore in your own ritual practice this question and to email me and tell me all about it, because it sounds like a fascinating exploration. But yeah, thanks.
Any follow-up question or share, Kevin?
No, that's great. I'll think about that and work on that. Yeah, that's really great. Thank you.
Thank you.
So Rebecca, there's Sahil dropped a couple of questions I can read out loud. But is there anything you'd like to do other than that? We have about 10 minutes left.
You know, I didn't have anything planned, and I usually do have some kind of ritual action planned, but I really did plan just to have a chat with you guys. And yes, I think I want to say something about this movement that I've made throughout the course of basically throughout the course of writing this the notes for this talk that I've given you, about this movement that I've made in the way that I approach the subject of ritual, and ask you all whether you can reflect on things in your life which need to be approached from a different direction, that perhaps that analytical defining thing, mode of thinking, isn't giving you what you need on that subject, and you could choose a subject like love or like faith or whatever, and just experiment with stepping in to a different epistemic approach to it. And that's a ritual in itself, right? Like, figure out what it would be like to think about something in your life from a different perspective, and then see where that takes you. Because as we were saying, like, it is play. So this kind of like this experimental playful thing doesn't have to mean you're going to become, you know, a neo shaman or a witch or anything, but just to explore and to push your brain into thinking in different ways, I think is really powerful. So that's kind of like my go away and think about this instruction for all of you. Yeah. But I don't have a ritual that I can pull out of the box for you right now, Peter. You have to book a consult.
Some great spiritual upselling there. Cool. So how about we gently close here? I'll have some closing announcements, but yeah, if anyone wants to book a consult with you, Rebecca, or find out more about your rituals that you're doing, how can they go about that?
Sure, just pop over to my Substack. It's called Rituals, and then in the About section, just press it like that, and you get all the details you need, and you can book there. Or you could just send me an email. My email's all over my Substack. I'd love to hear from you. Yeah, I see this practice as creating art with people. So if you want to create art with me, I think that would be really fun. I'm really up for it. And Nathan's just reminded me of a ritual. I think it might have to wait till the new year when I publish it on the Substack, but of this specific ritual that I'm working on, and I've been working with some people in our little secret chapel, which is exactly about this epistemic sliding and circumambulating a subject. So yes, sign up to my Substack, and maybe I'll get around to putting up a ritual before the solstice that we can all do in our separate homes, because it's so much about separateness and inwardness. But maybe I'll get around to putting up a ritual for you there. So yeah, check out the Substack basically, and if you want to get in touch, please do, because I would love to hear from you.
Very cool. And maybe you can invite a ritual we can do in New Year's or something like that. All of us can do together or separately at the STOA. And yeah, I reached out to Rebecca. I had a consult with her recently. It was lovely, about my launching my practice and having rituals baked into it. And I imagine, Rebecca, like, engaging with people brings greater sophistication in your skill set too. So on how to
Oh, for sure. I'm learning so much. And like, because a lot of people from the STOA I've spoken to, and you guys are also like great, like able to think in these abstract and to move your brains in interesting ways. You're just like the perfect people to work with. And yeah, and my relationship with ritual is deepening and developing because of my interactions with my clients. It's so exciting. I really love it. I'm genuinely super excited for you to come talk to me. And just for completely selfish reasons, because it's good for me. So yeah.
Beautiful, beautiful. So if you're watching on the YouTube, I'll put all the links in the video. And I imagine there's going to be more Rebecca Fox at STOA. So stay tuned for that. Rebecca, thank you so much for doing all you do and the magic that you create. Love to have you back. And next week at the STOA, Skylar Brown is coming back for another cultural embodiment session. It's going to be one every month for these. And last time was quite tender and awesome at 6 p.m. Eastern time on December 13th. That being said, Rebecca, everyone, thank you so much for coming to STOA today.